Hello everyone, it's been an incredibly long time since I've done one of these videos, a Grand Prix race review, but I thought there was no time like the present to start considering we just had the first race of the 2025 Formula 1 season, the Australian Grand Prix, which I was fortunate enough to be able to attend all 4 days of. It was a great time even though it was absolutely bucketing down with rain on the Sunday, but the race was very entertaining, very good, so we should dive right into it. I think we just have to first discuss what a great win that was by Lando Norris. He absolutely drove the wheels off that McLaren. He was outstanding, and I just wanted to start with that. But we'll go, I think, in chronological order here for the race. So we have to start with Isaac Hadjar. 6 rookies in the field this year, I believe, around that. And Isaac Hadjar, unfortunately, after a great qualifying performance, dropped it on the formation lap. I was actually sitting right in front of him. I was on the inside of turns 1 and 2, so saw him drop it. I've got a video where it just cuts to him in the barrier. A very easy to make mistake considering how wet the conditions were. However, you should not be making that on the formation lap. He was obviously just trying to get some heat into his tires considering the wet conditions. Just put a little bit too much throttle on, a bit too much steering lock at the same time, and unfortunately spun out. Once again, it's a very easy mistake to make. However, you just should not be making that. And poor Isaac, he looks so upset, and I don't blame him. Helmut Marko's comments after were completely uncalled for, and I just think unnecessary. Marko is probably getting to the stage now where I think he needs to move on from managing the Red Bull young drivers. But it was great to see Lewis Hamilton's dad go over and console him in the paddock afterwards. So now that we've covered that, let's go and look at the actual race start itself. It was a pretty good jump from, I think Verstappen got the best jump out of all 3 of the top 3 cars, really. Lando got a good jump, but Oscar also probably got a slightly better jump than Lando and was trying to pull ahead. Lando covered him off, and then Verstappen was forced to go to the outside. This allowed Lando to really take the lead into turn 1 convincingly. Oscar braked a bit late on the inside line, and Verstappen managed to go all the way around the outside of turn 2, reminiscent of his move in 2016 Brazil. It was a great overtake. Fantastic skills by Verstappen to just find the grip and go all the way around the outside of Oscar. It was really brilliant. Of course, you then had the 2 incidents Jack doing and Carlos Sainz doing was from a white line. Albert Park is a street circuit, so it has white lines just to, for traffic purposes throughout the year. They get rid of some of them, but not all of them. And unfortunately, I think this was just an instance where Doohan applied slightly too much throttle with a little bit of steering lock, and he just happened to have his rear tires on a white line, which unfortunately spun him out. But he did have a great qualifying performance up until he got kind of screwed over by the yellow flag. So I'd say he was pretty much on Gasly's level. Unfortunately, you can't really tell though from the race because he crashed out. Unfortunate, but he's making the right steps in order to keeping his seat and probably getting the full year in and not having Colapinto replace him. Carlos Sainz was the other driver to unfortunately go out on lap 1. He had that incident going into the penultimate corner under safety car, which is very unfortunate from Carlos. It seems to just be an issue with him not really understanding the Williams torque delivery in the safety car mode, or I suppose recharge mode that they have underneath the safety car, and it just gave him too much torque, spun the rear tires, and he just went straight into the barrier. It looks like a very inconspicuous incident to be having, especially in that location, and of course, very unfortunate. However, he apparently did play a very big role for the remainder of the Grand Prix, being kind of a strategist and really helped out the engineers. But it would have been better if he was still racing and on the track. So we then had Norris, Verstappen, and Piastri as the top 3, and Verstappen was doing a pretty good job to keep in the DRS of Norris, and Piastri was keeping up with Verstappen. Verstappen's tyres then seemed to go away from him. He managed to drop out of the DRS of Norris, and then he made a mistake going into the turn 11, I think it is. Going into turn 11 on the backside, the really good overtaking opportunity just locked up an outside front, and that allowed Piastri through. And from then, the McLarens just absolutely pulled away. They were so quick. They were over a second a lap quicker than Verstappen and basically every other car from that period where Piastri got passed up until that, just before they boxed, really. We should talk about the McLaren team orders at this stage. Piastri was told to hold position behind Norris. In the moment, at the Grand Prix, I was a bit annoyed about this order. 1, because I am Australian, and 2, because I didn't really have the context at the Grand Prix. However, looking back, I've watched the race replay, and I think it's the right call from McLaren here. There was no need for the drivers to fight. They had weather uncertainty, and of course they were still lapping back markers, and it was unfortunate timing that they had told Oscar that he could attack after he lost some time, and then of course he made that mistake going through the gravel at turn 6. So I think I liked how McLaren was confident in making this call, and I hope they continue on in that manner going towards the rest of the year. They just make confident calls rather than being indecisive, even if the calls themselves cause a bit of controversy. Then we had the next safety car. Alonso had a massive crash coming out of the treacherous turn 6. It was such a big issue for drivers just clipping the gravel. It would bring gravel onto the track and then the drivers would lose control. Of course, this is what happened to Alonso. I don't think he did anything really wrong here. He doesn't seem to be offline when this incident occurred, and he did not dip a wheel into the gravel. It just seems from what I've seen from the stills and from the replay that there was gravel on the track, and unfortunately he just might have added a bit too much steering lock through the corner as he was going over the gravel, and the car just snapped on him. It also snapped in a weird way. Usually you would expect the car to go the other way to what it did. So a weird incident. I feel a bit bad for Alonso because I find it hard to put the blame on him in this incident because it just doesn't look like he did anything really wrong that would aggravate this kind of crash. But he ended up in the barrier, and then we had a safety car called, which basically everyone pitted for and put on dry tyres, either the mediums or the hards. Verstappen went with the mediums, which I liked as an aggressive choice whilst the McLarens and most of the other teams went with the hard tyre. The safety car then went into the pits and we had a nice restart. However, more rain was expected because Melbourne weather is very unpredictable and it can go from rain to dry very instantly and then back to rain very quickly, which is what happened in the Grand Prix as the McLaren drivers were warned about increasing rain. However, going through the third last corner, both of them followed each other and ran wide. Norris managed to make a really solid recovery here, managed to get his car back to the actual road itself and was able to slow down enough before the second last corner. Piastri, however, did not manage to get his car back to the actual racetrack as quickly as Norris did, which meant he was carrying too much speed when he arrived at the corner, locked up his rear tyres, spun around, and I thought it was over for him. He just appeared to be spinning the wheels in the dirt just because of how wet it was. However, he did manage to be able to find reverse after a while and was able to slowly reverse out, but that basically cost him an entire lap. He just managed to stay from going a lap down, which was very critical for his race because if he goes a lap down, he finds himself in a much more difficult position. Norris instantly boxed at this stage, which I think was probably the right call, whilst Verstappen stayed out, which I think was the right call for Red Bull. I think at that time the right call was to box, but I like the aggressive strategy from Red Bull in order to try take the track position away from the McLarens, which I very much like. Unfortunately, it did happen to rain a bit heavier at this stage, and Verstappen and most of the other drivers were forced into the box, apart from the two Ferraris and Yuki Tsunoda, who I believe stayed out on the dry tyres. But we then had the safety car called at this stage for Bortoleto, had an incident. Apparently he had been struggling with a brake problem basically the entire race, but then he just appeared to lose the car on the exit curb. But then as he was spinning out, his rear suspension seemed to fail before he even touched the wall. So it's been not really known at this stage what actually caused the rear suspension to fail. It wasn't sure if the rear suspension issue was a kind of contributing factor towards his crash or whether it was just because the car was going backwards. It suffered some weird spiky loads that ended up causing it to break, but he might have been able to save it if the rear suspension hadn't broken, but of course we will never know. And then Liam Lawson had a crash in the same place Isaac Hadjar did, basically. He was on the dry tyres on a very wet track and just put a bit too much throttle in, spun out through the turn 1-2 complex, straight into the barrier. It was a very tough weekend for Liam. I do not envy him. He was slow, basically, the entire weekend. He missed running in FP3, which wasn't his fault. But he did make that mistake in qualifying, which caused him to miss out on going into Q2. However, he was really far back anyway. He was completely off the pace in comparison to Verstappen. So even if he made Q2, I don't think he was getting much further than that, unfortunately. So he will definitely be looking to rebound next week and hopefully show a bit more pace because unfortunately that first weekend looked a lot like Sergio Perez did last year. So I just quickly touch back to the Ferraris and Tsunoda here. I think they made a mistake on staying out on these dry tyres. It was clearly the wrong decision. So when they both pitted underneath the safety car, they both ended up all the way back in traffic. And Tsunoda was driving a great race at this stage, and this bad strategy call basically threw him under the bus. Both Ferraris were taken out of any form of contention. Unfortunately, they just seemed to lack pace at all this weekend anyway, so they weren't really on for victory, but they definitely did lose a lot of positions because of this strategy blunder from Ferrari and RB respectively. To finish the race then, we had an outstanding battle between Norris and Verstappen. Norris made a mistake going through turn 6 and that allowed Verstappen into DRS range, which then Verstappen was able to apply pressure, and the DRS is so powerful around here for DRS zone. He was able to keep within touching distance of Norris, which enabled him to keep the pressure on, and Norris did well not to crack underneath this pressure. It was a great end to the race, and Piastri himself had a great comeback to get into the points. His overtake on Lewis Hamilton on the final lap of the race through the turns 9-10 chicane was absolutely beautiful, millimeter perfect, managing to go around the outside of Lewis bearing in mind he did have a car advantage at this stage, probably over a second a lap going on the pace earlier in the race, but he still had to make it stick, and it was a great move. However, he did cost himself, and he will be kicking himself for that mistake he ended up making, which cost him the chance of a definite podium at this stage. So that was basically the entirety of the race. There's a couple more people I want to touch on. Antonelli, I think, had a stellar drive. He was on for a good result, but obviously was helped by the Mercedes strategy call to get him onto those intermediate tyres at the right time. He seemed to be the only driver really that was making moves throughout the field in the wet conditions. He showed bravery, and even with his spin, he recovered quickly and was able to get back by Hülkenberg. So a very good start by Antonelli. Of course, I got to shout out those midfield drivers that managed to get points. Albon, incredibly strong weekend, was quicker than Sainz, which you would hope at this stage because Sainz hasn't had much time in the car, but was great to see. Hülkenberg really delivered on the Sauber's performance. We seem to have a bit of an uptake in performance from testing, which I don't think many people were expecting, but again, he had a great weekend. And of course, Lance Stroll didn't crash, kept it clean, and got himself in the points at the end of the race, which is really all you want to ask for from this stage, and he did a good job. Nothing more than that. His qualifying pace was a bit slower than Alonso's, just marginally, but he did a great job in the race to collect those points. Overall though, bad day to be a rookie at Melbourne. It was predicted that most rookies would struggle with the wet weather, and that ended up being the case, apart from really Antonelli in the race, who I think drove, again, as I said earlier, a really solid race. Most other rookies seem to struggle, so they'll be looking to bounce back at China this upcoming weekend. So that pretty much summarizes the 2025 Australian Grand Prix. So what would I rate it out of 10? I'd give it an 8.5 or a 9 out of 10. The weather conditions on Sunday really aided this race in making it a lot more interesting with the unpredictability and the strategy. If it had been a dry race, I doubt it would have been as good or as interesting to watch. And I loved having Australia back as the season opener here. The racetrack itself is not as good as Bahrain. It's a street circuit. It's a normal public road throughout the year, so they can't do too much. And the circuit is quite narrow in comparison to a lot of modern Formula One tracks. But what it lacks in track, it makes up for the entire event. So many fans turn out, 465,000 people over the course of the 4 days, and the Sunday was incredibly wet, which is a great turnout and provides a great atmosphere. There's so many activities to do around the track. The city and the kind of country really gets behind the event. Is great for the drivers, and it's a great time, I think, to come out to Australia, make it the first race of the season. It's very interesting. So the overall event, I think, is really good, and that's what you should be looking for a season opening event. It's not just about the on-track racing, which of course I will admit Bahrain provides better on-track racing, but I think as an overall event, it's much better having the season opener at Albert Park than in comparison to Bahrain. And I think, and I hope, that the Australian Grand Prix is the first race of the season going forward like it was before COVID hit. So yes, let me know what you would rate the race out of 10 down below, if you think Australia should be hosting the season opener or if you think it should be going somewhere else. And hopefully you enjoyed this video. It's been a while since I've done one, so hopefully it wasn't too bad and you enjoyed it. But enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you guys in the next video.